Well, ladies and gentlemen, my first observation is to congratulate you all on your stamina. I think it's been a very demanding programme, and although it's been enormously enthralling, all of these discussions, it's very impressive that you have made it through to the tea session, as it were, on a Saturday afternoon. What I want to do, briefly, 20-25 minutes this afternoon, is to touch on a couple of aspects of the chapel's culture and development that have been touched on in the discussions so far, but to introduce two other themes. The idea of the academic community of Cambridge sharing much more than divided it, which Scott Mandelbrot adumbrated so lucidly this morning, I think is a fundamentally important point. But of course, it's also a fact that it's often between those who are closest in many other areas that the odium theologicum is at its most intense. And we will see a little of that today. The second aspect, thinking of this in broader terms, that I would like to look at is the way in which the college is not a completely united body in the 1630s, which, again, we've not yet touched on. And this has a major impact on the way in which the decorative scheme of the chapel is received. And the third aspect that I want to look at is to take the discussion down from the major national celebrities of Lord and Wren and the King and Buckingham and so forth, to the next level down, to the level of fellows of the college in the 1630s, and the wider networks of power and clerical patronage, which were at the core of any young divine's life, considerations of those. Careerism is extremely important in consideration of why the chapel is funded. Why do people put money into this, particularly as late as 1638 and 1639? So, to start with the question of those points of cultural unity and the inadequacy of the term Lorien, we've already seen in the discussion that Scott introduced us to how a window such as that of the east window of Lincoln College, Oxford, can look, in terms of the conventional discussion of Lordianism, a completely Lordian window, derived from Catholic exemplars, however, funded by a die-hard Calvinist, John Williams, Bishop of Lincoln, whom we have discussed this morning. The iconography is deeply rich in medieval style, with type and antitype, the crucifixion prefigured in the Old Testament, the resurrection prefigured by Jonah and the whale, and so forth. This is absolutely orthodox. It could be a Catholic window, and of course, it could be something that appeared in the medieval period. What is significant about it, I think, in stylistic terms, is the way in which the crucifix is, again, in a form that is quite common in medieval glass, simply a panel of the east window. There are many of those in England in the 1620s and 30s, surviving from the pre-Reformation period, and they're totally uncontroversial. At the Palace Chapel at Lambeth, Lord has a crucifixion scene in the east window, but that is the window that has been inherited from pre-Reformation usage, and his predecessor, a perfectly orthodox Calvinist, George Abbot, found nothing to object in that window whatever. But it was on that scale. It filled a single light. One of the puzzles of the Peterhouse window is its scale. That's the Williams window in Lincoln. That's Peterhouse. There are a number of big questions about it. The first is the donor. The donor, Phillip Skippin, comes to Peterhouse in 1614 as a sizer. He comes from a poor Norfolk family situated at West Lexham, some 15 miles east of King's Lynn. And he works his way through college, as sizes do, helping with domestic chores, waiting on tables, and the like. He is one of the most affluent donors to, or he's certainly one of the largest donors to the whole chapel project. Only bishops amongst the clergy give more than Luke Skippin. Where does the money come from? And why does he give on this scale? The second is the well-known association with Rubens. In 1638, when the window is inserted, Rubens is still alive. He is a former Spanish diplomatic representative to the court of St. James, and he is the most celebrated Catholic artist in Europe. How is it that a painting that is the source of this window, his so-called coup de lance, his so-called lance thrust of this Roman centurion here, how is it that this painting that is only completed in 1623, only 3 years before Wren starts planning the chapel, should find its way amongst this clutter of other personages who are not part of the Rubens design, so relatively soon thereafter. And of course, the other great puzzle is who is the actual maker of this window? There are currently 15 possible attributions in the literature, so take your pick. One thing we do know about the donor, and it's one of the very puzzling things about it, is that while you may not have heard of Luke Skippin, and most of the 17th century had not either, everyone knew about his brother, because everyone in mid-17th century England knew Phillip Skippin, who was one of the most prominent soldiers in England. Phillip Skippin was a colonel in the New Model Army. He was the figure who, at the start of the Civil War, is absolutely decisive in controlling London and making sure that it's held for Parliament. As soon as the king leaves in January 1642, it's Skippin who's put in charge of the train bands, and he remains in charge of London all the way through the Civil War. He's an extraordinarily powerful figure, and he is at one point proposed as the commander of the army of invasion to Ireland in 1646, which accounts for why that title, which he never actually took up, appears on that engraving. His brother is an interesting figure at a number of levels. He starts out poor, as I have mentioned, but his life is changed in 1623 when his uncle, William Skippin, leaves him almost all of his fortune. And this takes us into the area of scholarly networks that was touched on earlier. And it takes us to this world of Torstock in Devon. Torstock was the seat of the Bircher family, Earls of Bath, and its librarian was the vicar here, Oliver Naylor. All of that group go back to Keys in the 1580s and 1590s, a point when it is famed as one parliamentarian refers to it as a nest of popery. That is to say, a series of fellows have their intellectual formation under the Marian period, and their embrace of Protestantism is loose and certainly not warm. Oliver Naylor is one of that generation. Francis White is a contemporary of William Skippin, the future Bishop of Ely, and the person who consecrates the chapel. And of course, the other key figure the next generation on is John Curzon, whom they all know. William Skippin is secretary to the 3rd and 4th Earls of Bath, both of whom are educated at Keys, and keen ceremonialists. Oliver Naylor, the vicar, you can see how close the proximity is of the church to the house, is also a high ceremonialist, the librarian to the 4th Earl of Bath, and in a way, the library there is Cousin's second library. Naylor writes to Cousin regularly saying, what should I be buying in terms of new divinity for the library of the Earl? And so I think one of the things we need to think about in terms of intellectual networks is the way in which it's not simply the transmission of books, but the recommendations, the way in which people from afar, and this is miles away from any centre of metropolitan bibliophilic life, are determined by such key figures. Cousin at the time is secretary to Richard Neal, Bishop of Durham, and for much of the time, not in Durham, but in Durham House in London, and therefore part of a much wider intellectual network than the title Prebendary of Durham might suggest. The other point I would like to make, because again it ties in with earlier points that we made, is that this is an intellectual fault line. This is a fortress of Arminianism from the 1620s. Across the way, you see Barnstaple, and that is a notorious Puritan seat, a seat where the regular preacher during the 1620s and 30s and the Archdeacon of Barnstaple is none other than George Hakewell, the builder of Exeter College Chapel in 1624, as a celebration of the fact that Charles has not sided with the Spanish. And that place resounds with the preaching of Hakewell throughout the 1630s, offering very, very direct criticism of Charles's failure to engage in the 30 Years' War, which is the diplomatic and strategic background to the world that we're discussing. The other thing to note about Skippin is he's intimately involved in the whole chapel project. If we go back, these are instances of his fundraising for the chapel right at the start. One of the things that the college gets right, contemporaries please note, is it spends a lot on development. The amount of money spent on travel, meeting donors, being nice to donors, going to London, going to their country seats is enormous in comparison to the actual sums finally raised. Easily compares to modern rates, although we, of course, run an extraordinarily lean ship now. Here you have Skippin to see the Earl of Bolingbroke. Another instance here where he's taking a donation from Master Walpole of Norfolk, the Walpoles having a long association with Peterhouse that goes back to the Elizabethan period. Enough of the donor. But the only point that I would like to make is that Skippin's career as a clergyman is made by Wren. When he goes to Tavistock, having inherited this very large sum from his uncle, it is immediately disputed. He is the second son. Phillip Skippin ought to be the rightful heir. The case goes to the Prerogative Court of Canterbury in the summer of 1634, forgive me, and it is tried there by one of the senior judges, Sir Henry Martin, and against all expectation, and some would say against justice, the other members of the family are cut out, and the principal beneficiary, by a very large margin, of that benefaction is Luke Skippin. It transforms his life. It's not insignificant that I think that Sir Henry Martin is a close friend of Wren and one of the largest donors to the construction of the chapel. That pattern continues throughout Skippin's life. In 1636 and again in 1638, he receives extremely lucrative livings from Wren's patronage, and he does so in the most controversial of circumstances, including in 1638, the ejection by royal prerogative of the then incumbent at Torstock, because there has been a change of earl, and the earl involved is a strict Calvinist, educated at Trinity College, Dublin, friend of Usher and correspondent of Usher as Henry Boucher. You'll know it from the correspondence of Usher, and who has no truck with Skippin. Wren intervenes to save him and to absolutely impose Skippin on the unwilling patron there. He does so in Norfolk. So by the 1630s, the late 1630s, Skippin is a rich man on Wren's patronage. And that is not unrelated to the generosity of his donation. Who then is the painter of this window? There's been enormous speculation about this, and I can't pretend that the puzzle is completely elucidated, but it is getting there. This is the bottom left-hand corner of the window. Until we began this research project funded by Mark Slater in 2009, and David Scott and I started looking at this window in detail, there was not an opportunity to look at this window and actually see, was it signed? You know, the obvious thing that you would look for. And of course, it is signed. It's signed, as all windows tend to be of this period, simply with a monogram. I or J, it's a slight J, D, B. There is no English glassmaker of this period, and we're helped in sorting out who the identities are, because glassmaking is organised as a livery company in the same year that this window goes in. We know who's working. And the only contender is actually not an English glassmaker, but as you would suspect, an Antwerp maker who is in London at the time, and that is Jan de Labarre. All windows, as all engravings, are signed in Latin, so it will be Johannes de Bar. There is no definite article in Latin, and hence JDB at the bottom. There is more to find out about this figure, and his biography is not without its complications, as the classic work of reference published in 1911 illuminates. But he is made a member of the Guild of St. Luke in 1625 and is working in London quite extensively in 1625, working extensively in London in the 1630s. The point of contact is almost certainly Robert Peake. That is the entrepot in High Holborn of a series of continental artists and a hugely important centre for the development of English art. The young William Dobson is residing in Peake's studio during that period. It's the principal entrepot, too, of Flemish princes, as has already been mentioned, and the top seller, especially in ecclesiastical circles, are the prints of Boethius Bolsward, which sell in such quantity that Peake starts making his own versions of Bolsward prints. He has them re-engraved in England. They're of inferior quality, but they're the same original designs. Such is the demand. The window goes in 1638. These are the chapel accounts. For the first one is for June, about the fascinating subject of scaffolding. The first window to go in is in June, and it's the window, Our Saviour's picture in the south, southeast. And that is clearly the window that we discussed yesterday, that was closest to the East End, depicting appropriately Christ abluting, washing the feet of, and it stood immediately over the credence table, up the credentia, upon which the ritual objects of ablution stood. There's been much talk about the relationship of this building to King's. There is no relation whatever in the organisation of the stained glass windows to King's. In King's, they follow the medieval fashion of the pre-resurrection life of Christ is on the north side, and the post-resurrection life of Christ is on the south side. where it receives the sun, with the crucifixion forming the chronological centre. In Peterhouse, that simply could not have prevailed because a pre-crucifixion scene chronologically is placed on the south side. So that fundamental medieval king's pattern is not being replicated, whatever other associations there may be. Where does the window come from in terms of its design? Well, this bit is well known. It's from the coup de lance, the picture that I mentioned by Rubens that is inserted or installed as an altarpiece in the Church of the Récollets Franciscans in Antwerp in 1623, paid for by Nicholas Rocox, a close friend of Rubens. Its sacramental significance is obvious. There's an endless literature in patristic theology about the moment where Christ's side is opened and blood and water flows forth as an image of the blood of the new covenant and the blood that is, of course, consecrated, which is materialized by the act of consecration in the Mass. It is mediated to our window via engraving, like everything else. The engraving is by Boethius Bolsward. It's one of the very finest Bolsward engravings that exist. It's a large plate of extreme quality, and Rubens himself prepared the drawing on which it was based. So this dates from about 1629, well after the painting itself has been completed, and the engraving is issued in 1630 and immediately becomes a bestseller. It's hugely widely circulated and hugely admired, and it's on that basis that Rubens's 1623 design becomes current, or almost so, and we'll come to that reservation in a moment. The other sources are very interesting indeed and complicated. There's a long tradition, and it just shows how powerful oral tradition is in Cambridge, that lasts right through to the guidebooks of the early 19th century, that Lambert Lombard, a painter of Liège origin, born in 1503, and practicing right through to the 1560s, is the origin of this window, or part of the window. And I looked in vain, as have many historians, for a Lombard crucifixion in which anything related to the Peterhouse window appears. I was looking in the wrong place. It was only by happening upon this engraving, the first state of which does not even identify Lombard as the invenit, as the source, that I noticed familiar figures. You will see that the figures in the bottom left-hand corner, very close to the signature, are derived straight from this image of Christ teaching, and with only the very slightest of alterations of pose, are translated to our window. Conradus is a Veronese engraver, despite his Nordic-sounding name, and widely circulated. In fact, one of the interesting things about Lombard is that although it's a name that means almost nothing to the average enthusiast, even for 17th century art today, he was regarded by Vasari as the finest of the Netherlandish artists, and by 1604 he is seen as the finest Netherlandish artist that has been, of course, shortly to be eclipsed by Rubens. Almost nothing of his paintings survives as a consequence of the 30 Years' War, and the fact that he was based in Liège, which was one of the most fought over parts of the whole of the conflict. but we do have 500 engravings and drawings by him, which is some measure of how extensively his work was influential during this period. That's not the only source, though. There are problems and puzzles. One of them is the, nice to get a proper computer, the extensive depiction of mounted figures in the background, and indeed this pair too, that have a certainly Lombardian quality about them. And they evoke They evoke the world of Netherlandish painting of the late 15th, early 16th century. These are common in Lucas Cranach the Elder, Hans Memling. Mounted figures such as these are a regular feature of crucifixion scenes of that period. And again, we go back to a point about the syncretistic nature of the aesthetic of the chapel, which, as other commentators have noted, is not out of ignorance. The people planning this are well aware of what is going on architecturally and in terms of painting in London, a point I'll come to in a second. But there is a deliberate decision to locate the aesthetic of that window, not in the world of Rubens, but in the aesthetic of 100 years earlier. And that seems to me not without significance. It plays to themes that we have explored already. One of the most puzzling elements of it of all is the presence of this figure, someone who probably never even noticed, even in the longueurs of sermons. It's a very striking image, all the more so because it is actually a historical figure. It is derived from Martin van Heemskerk's image of the Emperor Charles V, and if there is any doubt about that, I think it's settled by the extraordinarily unusual and very specific bourgogne, special sort of parade helmet, which was actually made for the Emperor Charles V in Augsburg in 1527. That is what this figure is wearing. We can come to why that may be there. There isn't enough time to dwell on that now. The other source of ideas takes us to the world of cousin. The college has an extraordinarily close relationship with Somerset House and the Queen's household during the 1630s, and cousin represents that pole in a way that Wren represents the King's. It makes the college astonishingly well plugged in terms of power, politics, and patronage. In fact, there is an instance in early 1640 when a fellow of Peterhouse, actively involved in the promotion of the chapel, Richard Nichols, is called before the Vice-Chancellor's court for a drunken dinner party on New Year's night, 1640, where in an attempt to inveigle a young undergraduate who was about to graduate of St. Catherine's College to become a fellow at Peterhouse, he says, I can offer you not only a very large room and an allowance for books, I can get you an apartment in Somerset House. Needless to say, that's the form of bribery, not to mention drunkenness, that was disapproved of, and Richard's is a profound embarrassment to cousin, of course, who is in that year Vice-Chancellor. How he gets accused is another question that brings this story to its circle. The reference to Somerset House is not without relevance here. This is the Jones east end of the Queen's Chapel in Somerset House, unveiled and consecrated with enormous pomp in 1636, just before the major internal decoration scheme of the Peterhouse Chapel begins. That was where an altarpiece stood. And it was not just any altarpiece. It was an altarpiece of enormous significance to the king, a crucifixion scene that had been bought by the king's closest friend and advisor, favourite, the Duke of Buckingham, in 1624. and presented to the king in that year and given after Buckingham's death as a gift from the king to the queen, intended as the altarpiece for that position. It's currently, well, a copy, it's destroyed in 1645 by Sir Robert Harley in one of his purgers. He's the real iconoclast of the Long Parliament, and thrown into pieces, cut into pieces and thrown in the Thames. But a copy of it by Van Dyck, which shows its enormous dimensions, survives in the Louvre, and that's where it fitted. You will immediately notice certain familiar figures, because the figure on the right is the gold-clad Mary Magdalene that Rubens reused in the Coup de Lance, and even more tellingly is the figure of the Virgin to the right, to the left rather. Any contemporary who knew anything about the world of power in London, and especially the notoriety of Somerset House, would have immediately recognised that figure in the Peterhouse window as a window that could be seen in the Rubens image in Somerset House. That's not the only point that takes us to the court. And this is where the whole culture of Wren and the whole culture of Peterhouse needs to be differentiated from Lorienism, and that deeply compromised and confusing term. There had been no crucifix in the Chapel Royal of any of the royal palaces since the days of Elizabeth, who had only had a very small silver crucifix on the altar, which was itself highly controversial. Why is this controversial? Because crucifixes imply a theological view of the Eucharist as a sacrifice, as a propitiatory sacrifice, in which the faithful join miraculously via the priest's sacrifice of the bread and wine, and they become participants in the act of salvation enacted by Christ on Calvary. This is the complex theology of the Tridentine Eucharist, and of course it is one of the key points at issue in the Reformation. It's a point between Lutherans and Orthodox Calvinists in the 1620s and 30s, and it's in particular a point of issue between that great figure that we saw discussed this morning, John Williams, a powerful figure in determining the destiny of a very significant number of people in the church, because he's an extremely effective patron, and Matthew Wren. Before, the timing is important. Laud is accused at his trial of being the first person to introduce a crucifix into the Chapel Royal. He's not. The first person to do so was Matthew Wren, and he did so on Palm Sunday, 1637. And he introduced the crucifix by means of one of Henry VIII's tapestries. There are three sets that have survived through to the 1630s in the royal collection, and that these were Brussels tapestries of spectacular quality. The most important of them, however, was this, sold to the Spanish ambassador, Don Alonso de Cárdenas, in the 1650s and bought by a Spanish marquis, whence it survives now in the Prado. But it is almost certainly this tapestry that is hung up on Palm Sunday, 1637, and immediately provokes outrage. The master of the jewel house, Sir Henry Mildmay, says, nothing like this has been seen since Elizabeth's time, and this is a piece of arras that dates from King Henry's time. There is little doubt as to what is being taken up. And again, very briefly, because the time is pressing, I think that we need to think of the east window in part as an evocation in glass of the effects of tapestry. You see this particularly in the highly stylized treatment of the sky, which is very, very similar to the standard modes of Brussels tapestries of the early 16th century. The act of Peterhouse in inserting a crucifixion window on the scale of a tapestry in the Chapel Royal barely 8 months later is of profound significance. This is an act of theological solidarity, and on the part of its donor, it is a profound act of identification with the religious philosophy of Matthew Wren. Why does this matter at this moment? We go back to the Bishop of Lincoln and his towering figure, his towering status in the intellectual leadership of the English Church. Lincoln is Williams is on the back foot by this period, but in the midst of a campaign by the king to enforce the railing in of the altar in the mid-1630s, to which he is very strongly prompted in the first instance by Wren, there is a blast of the trumpet against the whole Wrenian policy, and it comes from this highly intellectual figure, John Williams, in the form of an anonymously or pseudonymously presented tract called The Holy Table, Name and Thing in 1627. And one of the pieces of good fortune in looking at Wren's life, about which it has always been said it's impossible to write anything because the sources don't survive, I came across Wren's copy of The Holy Table, Name and Thing, annotated throughout. I open it at this particular page because this line here, or this column here, really sums up the point at issue. And what Williams is writing there is, when the old fathers, that is the patristic authorities, call the Mass or Supper of the Lord a sacrifice, they mean that it was a sacrifice of laud and thanksgiving. Christ made no such difference between the priest and the layman that the priest should make oblation and sacrifice of Christ for the layman. So there's a complete repudiation of that which we have seen, of the separation of the priestly caste from the rest of the congregation, and there is simultaneously a repudiation of the theology that lies at its heart, that what is being enacted in the act of Holy Communion, or as Wren and Cousin insist on calling it, the Most Holy Eucharist, Sanctissima Eucharistia, that is profoundly at odds with anything that this powerful voice in the church, John Williams, is articulating. And of course, when the regime falls in 1641, it's Williams that the king turns to try and salvage something of his episcopal form of government by promoting Williams to the Archbishopric of York. Very briefly, I want to turn in the final section to just how this is received. And one general point that I think is not sufficiently figured in the art historical discussion of these objects and images is how they are used. Because so often in the 17th century discourse, what makes an object controversial is not the iconography of the object, it's not what it depicts, or not necessarily even its scale, though that is clearly provocative with our own window, and that is how it is actually treated in a liturgical and devotional setting. Three tiny examples to finish. On Lady Day, 1640, 18 months after the window has gone in, Richard Crashaw preaches on the Blessed Virgin. And one of the themes that emerges from this Wrenian circle is a very strongly Mariolatrous theme. And he preaches a sermon actually using the image in the glass as something that the audience is to be directed to. This is a standard mode of medieval homiletic practice. And he says, Hanc adoremus, hanc colamus. Let us adore this woman, let us worship her. Now, if you're looking for a reason why there are Marian antiphons in the Peterhouse part books, I think you may have part of the answer there. The second point is that And although we refer to this, again, in the received manner of the art historians as a crucifixion window, the most important figure in this window is actually the person on the horseback with the spear. The locus classicus for this in 1630s Cambridge, and if you look at in English books online and just look up Longinus, he is an immensely controversial figure. It's highly disputed between, as it were, Renian and Lorien divines as to whether there is any historical figure of Longinus. Calvinist and Orthodox Protestants say it's of no significance at all. But the locus classicus is the collection of stories and devotional martyrological tracts by Jacobus de Voragine, the Legenda Aurea, the Golden Legend, which is extensively read in 1630s Cambridge and commented upon with deep suspicion and criticism by the parliamentary commissioners of 1641. One of the people they single out for using the Golden Legend in relation to superstitious stories of the cross is Bernard Hale, Wren's future son-in-law, and who has been using the image of Saint Longinus as a starting point for his homiletic activities. Why is this significant? Longinus is, in the 1630s, the archetypal counter-Reformation saint. The story in the Golden Legend, which is at the core of why Rubens is painting this picture in 1623, is that Longinus is, yes, the Roman centurion who pierces Christ's side, but he is the repentant heretic. He repents of his ways, he sees the truth of Christian religion, spends his life in monastic, hermetic, he becomes a hermit, an eremite in the desert, and is finally martyred under Pontius Pilate, according to the Golden Legend. But for that reason, he is the patron saint of the blind. He has a particular significance in a college and in a liturgical and devotional culture, where the key objection you have to your Calvinist critics is that they are the blind and that they too are wounding Christ. Not everyone, I say, likes this. And I finish with the point that for one of the fellows, Richard Lee, this is the moment of no return. He breaks with cousin, has an extremely fractious relationship. But of course, the English church is never unipolar. There are always other patrons. And guess who he goes to? This is Buckton, the palace of the Bishop of Lincoln. And in 1639, he becomes vicar of Buckton, the likely future secretary to the Bishop of Lincoln when the current incumbent goes. And in 1641, it's Richard Lee who becomes principal state evidence against cousin for the great crucifix. I take my title from Richard Lee, that has been the source of such tension in that period. Thank you.
Good afternoon. First of all, I would like to thank the Master of the House and Dr. Adamson for inviting me. I was asked to to present some thoughts on the conservation of the stained glass in Peterhouse Chapel. Stained glass windows always show a very layered history, and we are always confronted with a lot of interventions. First of all, we normally speak about the original window, but we have to realize that the original window is never there. We better speak about the reference layer, because the original glass has deteriorated. It's very often it's polluted and so on. Above all this, stained glass windows have suffered very often of severe damage, mutilations because of vandalism and bad conservation or restoration. There is, of course, always the problem of pollution, bad cleaning. There are periods of neglect and up to now, very often poor repair. Above all this, we see that many stained glass windows have been replaced or reintegrated. And as we heard yesterday, most likely also the east window is not anymore in its original position. Today, we in the academic field, we speak about conservation and restoration. But even with this wonderful word, we have to say that we are not always sure about what we are doing. Are we really conserving? Are we really doing the right restoration? It's an ongoing process. On top of that, when we are missing pieces, we think about reconstructions or partly reconstruction, and especially concerning one window fragment, I was asked to present today some solutions for partly reconstruction of missing parts. At our university in Antwerp in conservation studies, we shifted from, we started 30 years ago in 1988. And in 1988, we were still working in the spirit of interdisciplinary research. And we saw conservation as more or less keeping the history as it was at that time. No, we shifted a little bit more to a more dynamic model. And we realized that, that we have to work more in a transdisciplinary way. And by doing so, since 15 years, we see that heritage is a real organic reality, and that every time and every place has its own decisions, sometimes its own madness, sometimes sublime solutions. And we have to realize that we are not better than our predecessors, and we will probably not be better than our successors. Transdisciplinary research means that we open several perspectives. One of the normal perspectives is that we study archival documents and literature. Sadly, I have to say that a lot of archival documents, especially when it comes to recipes and working methods, is not very reliable in the field of glass and glass paints. You see here a scheme of a lot of books and manuscripts on stained glass production, glass paint production. And most of these books and recipes are written in the alchemistic tradition and are copies from one another, sometimes going back to the Mappe Clavicula. And I have to admit that a lot of these recipes, when we test them, are not working at all. So only a few documents show recipes that are very close to the daily practice. So studying ancient documents also means that we have to be very careful drawing conclusions. Another document, Dr. Adamson already showed the page where we found the name of Jan de Labarre. And this is the same Guild document with the member list of the St. Luke's Guild in Antwerp. And this is a very interesting document because it's a 16th century document, but it's one of the few documents where we see stained glass, stained glass craftsmen's tools in this beautiful decoration. So we see soldering irons and grousing irons and so on, and brushes. There are not so many depictions of the tools of stained glass artists. Other sources are, as I already said, the good recipe books. You see two documents, an Antwerp manuscript dating from around 1500, and a Ghent document with recipes that show to be very reliable. But also the Hans Memling diptych, dated 1487, shows us the first application of enamels, already in use in Bruges in the late 15th century. So not only the blue enamel, but also a reddish, more or less, we cannot say if it was an enamel or a kind of red grisaille, but that painting shows that these glass paints were not invented in the 17th century, but were already in use in Burgundy, Flanders in the end of the 15th. So also this paintings and engravings give sometimes very interesting information. Dr. Adamson already showed the beautiful engraving as one of the models for the stained glass window here in Peterhouse. There is also a wonderful oil paint sketch by Rubens, and of course, together with all this other related material, that gives us an insight in the inventio which was made for Peterhouse. And it was very common in that period that several visual sources were used to draw a cartoon and to realize a stained glass window. Another perspective is natural science, and I have to acknowledge here my colleague Dr. Koen-Janssens and Simone Cagno, two colleagues from the University of Antwerp who are working together with us on glass research and scientific research on glass. Here you see some microscopic views of flashed glass. And here are the analysis of some samples, 4 samples that we have taken some years ago from the window, the panel of the window fragment, which is in the entrance here. So the interesting thing that we learned from these 4 samples is that, at least for that panel, 3 of the samples show high lime, low alkali glass. It means that they are high in calcium and low in potassium. And that composition is very, very close to what we see at that time in the Low Countries. It's a glass produced in Alsace-Lorraine, nowadays in the east of France, but at that time it was sometimes Germany, sometimes Burgundy, sometimes France. And that production starts in the end of the 15th century. And in fact, it's a glass which is at least 30% cheaper than the Normandy production, which was for a long time the main glass used for stained glass production in France and the Low Countries. What we see is that glass is produced in an enormous volume and transported over the Rhine and the River Maas to Dordrecht, nowadays in Holland, and from Dordrecht over canals to Antwerp, and then from the port of Antwerp, transported all over the known world, so not only to England, but also to Portugal, Italy, Spain. So 3 samples show a glass which is also in use at that time in the Low Countries. And, there's nearly no difference with the high lime, low alkali glass, which has been used in the Low Countries from the end of the 15th century up to the middle of the 17th century. 1 sample shows soda glass, which means that glass is certainly dated after 1830, because the soda glass production starts after 1830. So that's quite remarkable, because in that fragment panel we know that there are also 19th or 20th century panes of glass. One last element, one last perspective, when we study ancient techniques and ancient production methods, is that we also reproduce, according to old recipes, we reproduce glass panes. And here you see some slides where I was busy with the reproduction of 17th century enamels, according to recipes that apparently worked. Not all of them were successful. So when we come to the Peterhouse windows, especially the Crucifixion window, shows a lot of damage and poor repairs. There is severe corrosion of the glass. I don't know if you can see it, but for instance, here on this piece, there are the white spots, and also over there, the white spots on the glass are in fact corroded pieces, and that's not good, because glass corrosion is a process. When it starts, it goes quicker and quicker, and it makes the glass darker and darker, and in fact the corrosion is eating the glass. So apart from that, we also see a lot of mending leads. So mending leads are in fact repair leads. There are strap leads. There are backplated pieces of glass, several places. And in general, the present leading is very heavy. For the 17th century, a stained glass window of that period would have lead of about 5 to 6 millimeters. And in this case, the lead is in many cases, it's 8, 10, 12 millimeters. It made the last repairs of the last restoration work was for sure. They wanted to have a very strong, well-made panels, but in fact it makes the window much darker than it originally was, and also less easy to understand because of all these mending leads and strap leads. So that's certainly something to think about in the future when conservation will be undertaken. Well, we have seen the same slides yesterday. There is one window partly conserved, and I was asked to present some thoughts about possible reconstruction. I've brought 3 examples of reconstruction. Making infills is always controversial, because in the worst case, it's considered as a falsification. So when we make an integrated reconstruction based on evidence, on visual evidence, in this case, it's also an engraving by Maarten de Vos, and the small roundel was missing quite a large piece of glass, so about 20% was missing, this piece. So it's an integrated reconstruction, but as you see, I used the glass which is slightly lighter than the original glass. Another example is an example of a nearly integrated reconstruction. It's in general better accepted in the field because it's not only a glass which is slightly different in color, but also the trace lines have been hitch-hatched in a way that it is quite easy to see that it is an infill. Also, infills are always marked with a monogram and a date, and it's making clear that it is not an original piece. And the third case is another panel of the 17th century, where, well, we don't know whose coat of arms it was because the text is not in order. So it is this has been mixed up, this cartouche. We only have the mantling and the crest, but we don't know what the shield of arms was showing. So the infill is just tracing the form of the shield of arms according to other panels in the Rijksmuseum and the Museum of Leeuwarden in Holland, but no further details. So 3 options. There are much more nuances, but in fact, I want to point out that partly reconstruction is possible as long as we respect the principle of reversibility, the principle that a new intervention has to be distinguished, it has to be distinguishable in a certain way. 3 examples. In one example, not very visible, but this one is very visible. And that gives material to think about that fragment of the window if somebody would be thinking about possible reconstruction. So I want to finish with another suggestion about the future conservation of all stained glass in the chapel. Nowadays, the east window has no protection at all. Years ago, there must have been some wiring, it disappeared, but considering the fact that the window is showing corrosion, I would really hope that protective outer glazing would be installed, and also for the side windows. Protective glazing, which is the existing protective glazing, is certainly not protecting because there is no ventilation of the windows. There is a lot of hostility everywhere against protective glazing because it changes the outlook of a church. And especially here at Peterhouse, the windows are quite low, they can be seen from the street side. So for this case, I would really recommend the use of non-reflecting glass. We have a very good example in Antwerp at the chapel of the St. Elizabeth Hospital. We installed their non-reflecting glass. It's yearly showered, the windows are cleaned, and the oldest installation is dating back, I think, about 15 years or 20 years, and you still can't see that there is protective glass in front of the stained glass windows. So visually, you don't see the protective glass. It's a little bit more expensive than ordinary float, but aesthetically, it's such a good solution, and especially for this chapel, I would really recommend the installation of protective glazing, of course, with the appropriate ventilation of the stained glass window, but certainly with non-reflective glass. We are running out of time. I will close my presentation here. I hope there are some questions. We can discuss a little bit about the conservation issues. There is a lot to be discussed about the future of the chapel, the light in the chapel. And of course, the stained glass plays an enormous role in how the chapel can get an improved light situation. But I think you should act quite slowly, step by step. Maybe start with the most easy steps, polychromy of the furniture, the polychromy of the ceiling, thinking about the floor. The stained glass is maybe one of the most difficult issues in this chapel. Everything is possible, but not everything is necessary. So take it easy, and I would love to be back and take part in this discussion. Thank you.